The airport was alive with movement, passengers rushing to their gates, luggage wheels rolling across the floor, and overhead announcements echoing through the terminals. Among the crowd stood Jordan, a successful businessman on his way home to Atlanta after closing an important deal. Unlike the hurried travelers around him, he remained calm, patiently waiting to board his first-class flight. But just a few seats away, Margaret, an older woman with an air of entitlement, had already taken notice of him. Her disapproving glare and muttered words made it clear she didn't think Jordan belonged in first class. As the boarding call echoed through the terminal, Margaret wasted no time stepping in front of Jordan, cutting him off with a forced smile. "Excuse me, young man, but first-class boards first," she said, her voice laced with condescension. Jordan met her gaze, unfazed. "Ma'am, I am flying first class too," he replied simply. Margaret raised an eyebrow, letting out a sarcastic chuckle. "Oh, well, isn't that something?" she muttered, stepping forward. Jordan sighed, brushing off the interaction. He had no idea this was only the beginning. The airport buzzed with life. Passengers rushing to catch flights, flight attendants making announcements, and the hum of conversations filling the terminal. Among the travelers stood Jordan, a black businessman in his mid-40s, exuding quiet confidence as he checked his phone and adjusted his suit. He had just wrapped up a successful business deal and was heading home to Atlanta, looking forward to a peaceful flight in first class. But not everyone around him shared his calm demeanor. Sitting a few seats away, Margaret, an older woman dressed in expensive attire, took notice of Jordan. With a sharp glare and a disapproving shake of her head, she muttered under her breath, her expression making it clear she didn't believe he belonged in first class. As the boarding announcement echoed through the terminal, passengers began lining up. Jordan gathered his belongings, ready to board, when Margaret suddenly stepped in front of him, cutting him off. With a forced smile, she turned to him. "Excuse me, young man, but first-class boards first," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. Jordan, never one to seek unnecessary conflict, kept his voice steady. "Ma'am, I am flying first class too." Margaret's eyebrows shot up in surprise before she let out a sarcastic chuckle. "Oh, well, isn't that something?" she muttered, stepping forward without another word. Jordan sighed, shaking his head, choosing to ignore the interaction. He had no idea that this was only the beginning of an encounter that would test his patience, and ultimately, deliver a lesson in karma. The airport gate was bustling with passengers lining up to board, eager to settle into their seats. Jordan stood patiently in the first-class queue, his posture relaxed as he scrolled through his phone. He had earned this moment, a well-deserved reward after securing a major business deal. The anticipation of a comfortable flight back home to Atlanta was all he focused on. That was until a presence beside him disrupted his peace. Margaret, an older woman with an air of entitlement, strutted toward the boarding line. Dressed in elegant attire, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed they belonged among the elite. As her gaze landed on Jordan, her expression shifted to one of disapproval. Without hesitation, she stepped in front of him, cutting the line as if he wasn't even there. Jordan raised an eyebrow but remained calm. Before he could say anything, Margaret turned to him with a forced smile. "Excuse me, young man, but first-class boards first," she said, her tone laced with condescension. Jordan met her gaze without anger, his voice steady. "Ma'am, I am flying first class too." Margaret's eyebrows shot up in mock surprise, before she let out a sarcastic chuckle. "Oh, well, isn't that something?" she muttered, shaking her head, as if the very idea amused her. With that, she turned away and stepped forward, acting as though Jordan's presence in first class was some sort of anomaly. Jordan took a deep breath, choosing to ignore her attitude. He had no intention of letting a stranger's ignorance ruin his flight. Little did he know, This was only the beginning of a long and exhausting encounter, one that would test his patience and ultimately prove that karma has its way of settling scores. As Jordan settled into his window seat in first class, he exhaled, hoping for a smooth and uneventful flight. But the moment Margaret lowered herself into the seat beside him, he could already sense the tension. She let out an exaggerated sigh, shifting uncomfortably as if merely sitting next to him was an inconvenience. With a disapproving glance, she muttered just loud enough for him to hear, "I can't believe they let just anyone sit here these days." Jordan glanced at her but said nothing, choosing to ignore the comment. He had dealt with people like Margaret before, people who believed their wealth or status gave them the right to belittle others. But Margaret wasn't done. As the plane took off, she pressed the flight attendant call button repeatedly, complaining about trivial things. The air conditioning was too cold. Her seatbelt was too tight. The food wasn't up to her standards. And with each complaint, she managed to sneak in a passive-aggressive jab. "This flight just isn't what it used to be," she said, shaking her head. "Back when they had real first-class passengers, things were much better." Jordan clenched his jaw but remained composed. He had spent years mastering the art of patience. But when she turned to him directly, her expression smug, and sneered, "People like you don't belong here," he had enough. Turning to her, he met her gaze with calm resolve. "Ma'am, I have been nothing but polite to you. I'd appreciate it if you kept your comments to yourself." Margaret scoffed, rolling her eyes. "You people are so sensitive. Can't even take a joke," she muttered. Jordan sighed, looking away. The flight had barely begun, but he already knew it was going to be a long one. The flight had been tense, but Jordan had done his best to ignore Margaret's constant jabs. He had remained calm through her passive-aggressive remarks, her endless complaints, and the pointed way she spoke about people like him. But then, she crossed a line. As the flight attendants moved through the cabin serving drinks, Jordan adjusted his seat, shifting slightly to get comfortable. Margaret, still seething with unspoken resentment, suddenly reached over and grabbed his arm. Her grip was firm, her fingers digging into his sleeve. She leaned in, her voice sharp and filled with disdain. "Listen here, boy," she sneered, her tone dripping with superiority. The cabin fell into an eerie silence. The hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, everything stopped. Nearby passengers turned in their seats, eyes widening at what they had just witnessed. A few rows back, a young woman, who had been watching the interaction unfold, quickly pulled out her phone and hit record. Jordan inhaled deeply, forcing himself to stay composed even as his pulse quickened. He pulled his arm free, looking Margaret directly in the eyes. "Ma'am, I need you to take your hands off me right now," he said, his voice steady but firm. Before Margaret could respond, a flight attendant rushed over, her expression filled with concern. "Ma'am, I need you to keep your hands to yourself," she said, her voice professional but firm. Margaret scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "Oh, don't be ridiculous. I was just trying to talk to him," she huffed. The flight attendant didn't back down. "This is your final warning. If you continue harassing this passenger, we will have to involve the authorities when we land." Margaret's face turned red with frustration. She crossed her arms, muttering under her breath. But for the first time since the flight began, she seemed to realize that she was no longer in control. What she didn't know was that her actions had already been caught on camera, and soon, the whole world would see exactly what kind of person she was. The tension in the cabin remained thick, but Margaret still refused to back down. Despite the flight attendant's warning, she kept throwing sharp glances at Jordan, muttering insults under her breath. Then, with a smug smirk, she accidentally knocked over Jordan's drink, sending the liquid spilling onto his tray table and lap. "Oh, clumsy me," she said, her voice laced with mock innocence. She didn't even offer an apology. Jordan closed his eyes briefly, taking a deep breath. He had done everything to ignore her, to stay composed. But it was clear. Margaret wasn't going to stop. The passengers around them exchanged uneasy glances, some whispering to each other. The young woman who had been recording shook her head, disgusted, making sure to capture every second. Then, the intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've been informed of a disturbance on board, and law enforcement will be meeting us at the gate upon landing." Margaret's smug expression vanished in an instant. She sat up straight, her face draining of color. "What? This is ridiculous," she blurted, looking around as if searching for support. I was the one being harassed. This man was threatening me." She pointed an accusatory finger at Jordan, hoping to turn the situation in her favor. But the young woman behind them stood up, holding her phone high. "That's not what happened, ma'am. I have everything recorded." The murmurs in the cabin grew louder as more passengers nodded in agreement. Margaret's panic deepened, her hands trembling. You can't be serious," she stammered. Moments later, as the plane taxied to the gate, uniformed officers stepped inside. One of them pulled out a phone, reviewing the footage before turning to Margaret. "Ma'am, we've seen the video. Please come with us." Margaret's jaw dropped. But I'm an old woman. This isn't fair," she cried, desperately clinging to her seat. "Old or not, you're responsible for your actions," the officer replied firmly. "Let's go." As they pulled Margaret to her feet, the entire cabin erupted into applause. Jordan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, finally able to relax. A flight attendant approached him with an apologetic smile. "We're so sorry for everything you've been through. Your next flight with us is on the house." Jordan chuckled, shaking his head. "Thank you. I just hope people like her finally learn their lesson." With his head held high, he stepped off the plane, knowing that, sometimes, karma doesn't take long to arrive. As Jordan stepped off the plane, a flight attendant walked up to him with a sincere smile. "We truly apologize for what you went through," she said. "Your next flight with us is completely on the house." Jordan chuckled, nodding in appreciation. Justice had been served, and Margaret had faced the consequences of her actions. As he walked through the terminal, he couldn't help but think, sometimes karma works faster than expected. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more fascinating content. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.